The night is deep and still in the heart of the Wichita Mountains, a sacred land where the Comanche have thrived for generations. The year is 1848, and beneath a vast Oklahoma sky, a village lies at peace, its people wrapped in slumber, trusting in the security of their homeland. Inside a warm, hide-covered teepee, a young mother cradles her infant son, the soft glow of the fire casting flickering shadows against the buffalo hide walls. This woman is Nauta, known to some as Cynthia Ann Parker, but to her people, she is a Comanche mother, wife, and survivor. She is the beloved partner of Peta Nocona, a respected war chief whose name is spoken with reverence. And in her arms sleeps their firstborn, Quanah, a child who will one day bear a name that echoes through history. Since the moment of his birth, Peta has watched over his son with pride, boasting to his fellow warriors of the boy's strength, his spirit, his destiny. Among the Comanche, the measure of a man is his ability to ride, to hunt, to fight, his ability to protect his people. Sees these qualities already taking root in his son, and he envisions the great deeds the boy will accomplish. But tonight, the father is not here. He and the warriors of the village are far away, riding under the same moonlit sky, answering the call of battle. For Nauta and her child, the night is quiet. But out beyond the sleeping village, unseen in the darkness, danger is already moving. Far from the village, under the same vast sky that stretched endlessly over the southern plains, Peta Nocona and his warriors rode with purpose. They were Comanche, Numa, the lords of the plains, warriors who had carved their dominion across the heart of the continent, staking their claim to the richest hunting grounds, the most coveted rivers, and the open expanses where the buffalo roamed in uncountable herds. For nearly a century and a half, their power had been unquestioned, their supremacy unchallenged. Those who had dared to stand against them, the Tonkawa, the Spanish, the Texans, had been crushed, scattered, or forced to bow in submission. With every victory, however, new enemies emerged. From the scorched deserts of New Mexico to the wooded hills of the southern plains, Comanche warriors had waged war against nearly all who crossed their path: Spanish settlers, itinerant Mexican farmers, American fur traders, rival tribes like the Kiowa, and above all, the Navajo. Their conflict with the Diné was among their oldest, a struggle not only for survival but for dominance, for the right to claim the land beneath their horses' hooves. The Comanche did not take trespass lightly. To them, every blade of grass, every stretch of prairie, every drop of water was hard-won, secured through blood and war. And so, when word came that Navajo warriors had been spotted in the area, Peta Nocona did not hesitate. Gathering his raiders, warriors from the Quahati, and likely a few from other bands, including allies among the Kiowa, he rode west. Their purpose was clear: to meet their ancient rivals in battle, to drive them back, to remind them that these lands belonged to the Comanche. And yet, even as they disappeared into the horizon, their minds set on war, the warriors did not know that they had already fallen into a trap. For generations, the land itself had been a battlefield. Unwritten histories, carried in the breath of elders, told of endless cycles of war, of blood spilled beneath the same sky that watched over the great herds of buffalo. The struggle for survival was relentless, not just against the bitter cold of winter or the merciless droughts of summer, but against rival nations who fought for the same rivers, the same hunting grounds, the same sacred places. To be strong was to endure, to conquer was to secure the future of one's people. Among the warriors of the plains, raiding was not simply an act of war. It was tradition, a test of skill, courage, and cunning. To strike at an enemy, to take from them as they had taken from you, was not only honorable, it was necessary. Across the vast expanse of the continent, this was understood. A village left undefended was a village that might not see another sunrise. Warriors who rode under the cover of night did not always return home. But if they did, they brought with them the stories of their deeds, the wealth of their enemies, and the pride of their people. For those who fell into the hands of their foes, fate offered little mercy. Some, particularly the young, might be taken in, raised among those who had slain their kin, molded into warriors of a different nation. Others would not be so fortunate. Their suffering would become legend, whispered in firelight by traders and scouts, spoken of in hushed tones by those who feared the return of riders on the horizon. The raids came when they were least expected, sometimes under the cover of a moonless sky, sometimes in the dead chill of winter when hunger made men desperate. A single moment of weakness could erase an entire village, leaving behind only the wind to remember what once was. Yet war was not the only language spoken between nations. While some fought, others traded, forming bonds that could last for generations, alliances built on shared needs, on mutual survival. The borders of these nations were not drawn in ink, but in blood, shifting with the tides of war, famine, and peace. Strength alone determined who would remain and who would vanish, their names carried away on the wind like the smoke of forgotten fires. The land was never still. It shifted with time, with war, with the relentless push and pull of nations rising and falling like the tides. The Crow, once masters of their domain, had been forced westward by the Sioux, their lands lost to stronger warriors who wielded the power of the horse like a weapon. The Apache, fierce and resilient, had been driven from the vast expanse of Texas, pushed to the dry, rugged frontiers of New Mexico and Arizona, their old hunting grounds now claimed by the relentless advance of the Comanche. To the Diné, known to outsiders as the Navajo, the struggle for land and survival was nothing new. For generations they had fought their neighbors, the Apache, the Ute, locked in the same cycle of war and uneasy peace that defined the Great Plains and the deserts beyond. Yet even in 1848, no enemy stirred their hatred like the Comanche. They had seen the devastation wrought by the horse-born raiders who struck without warning, who stole their people, their livestock, and left villages smoldering in their wake. To the Diné, the Comanche were not just rivals, they were a force to be reckoned with, a storm that swept across the land, impossible to predict, impossible to ignore. But the Diné were survivors, shaped by the land itself. They had come from the far north, their ancestors migrating down from the Athabascan-speaking tribes of Alaska and Canada, their journey leading them to the Red Rock Canyons, the mesas, and the open spaces of what would become Arizona, Utah, and New Mexico. Once hunters who followed the rhythms of the land, they learned to cultivate it, adopting the ways of the Pueblo, planting corn, beans, and squash in dry soil, carving out an existence in a land that offered little but demanded much. Then came the Spanish, and with them, everything changed. Sheep and goats became part of Diné life, a source of wealth and survival, their wool woven into blankets that became some of the finest trade goods in the Southwest. But the Spanish brought more than livestock. They brought war, enslavement, and an uneasy relationship of trade and conflict that echoed across generations. Just as they raided, they too were raided, caught in the same brutal cycle that defined the land and all who lived upon it. For the Diné, existence was never just about survival. It was about adaptation, about resilience. They had fought for their place in the world before, and they would fight for it again. In the vast, untamed lands of Texas, the Comanche did not simply rise to power, they forged it with fire, speed, and an unbreakable will. Their journey began far to the north as an offshoot of the Shoshone, a people who once roamed the high country of the Rocky Mountains. But where they had once been wanderers, bound to the land by foot, their destiny changed the moment they met the animal that would redefine their very existence, the horse. At first, they were like many others, cautious, uncertain of the power that galloped across the plains. But soon they mastered it, bending it to their will, and in doing so, they transformed not just themselves, but the balance of power across the southern plains. What had once been a people of hardship became a people of opportunity. In the span of a few generations, they rose from struggling survivors to ruthless tacticians, their warriors moving like the wind, striking where they pleased, vanishing before their enemies could react. With their newfound speed and reach, they saw what others had already discovered. Power did not come solely from the bow or the lance, but from control. Control over trade, over movement, over the flow of wealth between nations. In the 1700s, they looked to the Ute, who had long profited from a different kind of warfare, the trade of human lives. They watched, they learned, and then they joined in, turning raiding into an enterprise. For a time, the Comanche and Ute stood side by side, their war parties riding out against the Navajo, the Jicarilla Apache, and the Lipan Apache, sweeping into villages, scattering warriors, and taking what they wanted, horses, goods, and most of all, captives. These raids were not chaotic acts of vengeance. They were methodical, calculated, and as efficient as any slaving operation across the oceans in Africa or the Americas. For decades, the captives, mostly women and children, were forced to march across the arid lands of New Mexico, their fates sealed in distant markets where they were bartered, sold, or adopted into new tribes. Some found themselves woven into the fabric of new families, their old identities erased. Others were left to the mercy of slavers, traders, and those who saw them as nothing more than commodities to be exchanged. The world of the southern plains was not one of mercy. It was one where strength dictated survival, and the Comanche had become its undisputed masters. For the Dene, the Navajo, the name Comanche carried weight. It was more than just an enemy. It was a shadow on the plains, a name spoken with a mix of defiance and dread. Even the Spanish, who had battled warriors across 2 continents, understood the power of the Comanche. In 1786, a man of diplomacy and strategy, Juan Bautista de Anza, saw an opportunity. If the Spanish could not defeat the Comanche, they would do the next best thing, turn them into allies. The peace brokered between de Anza and the Comanche was nothing short of remarkable. For decades, these warriors had been the scourge of Spanish settlements, raiding with ruthless precision, vanishing into the open plains before retaliation could come. But with the right words, the right concessions, de Anza accomplished what many thought impossible. He secured a fragile truce with the very people who had once hunted his own countrymen. Yet diplomacy is a game of leverage, and de Anza understood its rules well. When the Navajo leaders came to discuss peace, they did not find a Spaniard negotiating alone. They found a man who had already made powerful friends. The Comanche, once their most feared enemy, were now his allies. The message was clear: accept peace on Spanish terms, or face the riders who had laid waste to so many before. The Dene understood the choice before them. Reluctantly, they agreed. For a time, the southern plains knew an uneasy peace, a rare moment of stillness in a land shaped by war. To the Comanche, this was not just politics, it was power. They called themselves Nemo, the people, a nation set apart, superior, forged by the winds of the plains. Mercy was not their way. To trespass upon their lands, to stand against their will, was to invite destruction. And yet, despite this unyielding worldview, their bloodline was one of the most diverse among all native nations. This was no contradiction, it was strategy. The Comanche did not simply raid for plunder, they raided to expand their people. For generations along the Texas frontier, countless families, Tonkawa, Karankawa, Lipan Apache, Mexican settlers, Texas homesteaders, had been shattered in the chaos of war. Their warriors cut down, their women and children taken, some to be sold, others to be adopted. Those who survived long enough to prove their worth found themselves reborn, given new names, new identities, and for some, a place among the very people who had once been their captors. It was a world built upon dominance, but also adaptation. The Comanche knew that survival was not just about conquest, but about strength in numbers, about absorbing the useful and discarding the weak. And so with every raid, with every captive taken, the lineage of the Comanche grew, not just in blood, but in the unbreakable will of those who had been forged by fire and war. For those captured by the Comanche, fate was a path with only 2 outcomes: enslavement or assimilation. Some were traded to other tribes or sold to New Mexico traders, their lives bartered away like commodities on the harsh frontier. But others, particularly children, were absorbed into the fabric of Comanche society, molded into warriors, hunters, and keepers of the land. For the youngest captives, this transformation was often seamless, their old identities slipping away as they were raised as Comanche. But for those old enough to remember their past, the journey into acceptance was one of hardship, trial, and endurance. Upon arrival, captives were thrust into the lowest ranks of the camp, burdened with the most grueling and thankless tasks, scraping buffalo hides, hauling water, tending to the great herds of horses that symbolized power and wealth. Survival depended not just on strength, but on the ability to endure. Some withered under the weight of this brutal test. Others proved themselves worthy, carving out a place in a world that had once been their enemy. Cynthia Ann Parker, later known as Nauta, was among them. Born in Crawford County, Illinois, in either 1824 or 1825. She had been just a child when her grandfather, John Parker, a veteran of the Continental Army, led their family to Texas in search of a new beginning. But Texas was a land drenched in conflict, its soil stained with the blood of those who dared to settle on the fringes of Comanche territory. The settlers built Fort Parker, a fragile sanctuary against the warriors who had long ruled these lands. But on the morning of May 19, 1836, their illusion of safety was shattered. The Comanche came swiftly, their war cries piercing the quiet, their lances and bows striking with deadly precision. The men of the Parker family, Samuel Frost, Robert Frost, Silas Parker, Benjamin Parker, were cut down, scalped where they stood. John Parker, the man who had once been a soldier, suffered a fate too gruesome to recount. The fort was overrun, its walls unable to keep out the storm that had come for them. Cynthia Ann, only 9 years old, was taken, along with others, Elizabeth Kellogg, John Richard Parker, Rachel Parker Plummer, and her infant son, James Pratt Plummer. But for James, the journey would not last. Too young to understand silence, his cries sealed his fate. The Comanche, unwilling to risk exposure, ended his life in a manner swift and merciless, a reminder that on the frontier, weakness was not tolerated. For the rest of the Parker captives, their futures diverged. Some were ransomed and returned to a world forever changed. But Cynthia Ann remained, not as a prisoner, but as something else. Taken in by a Comanche woman, she was shielded from the horrors inflicted upon others, guided toward a new life among the people. Though she faced hardship, though she endured cruelty in the early days, she was not cast aside. Slowly, over the years, she became one of them, not as an outsider, but as a Comanche. Her past life faded, replaced by a new identity, a new name. She would not live as Cynthia Ann Parker, but as Nauta, wife of Nocona, mother of Quanah Parker, future war chief of the Comanche. Her blood carried the legacy of both Comanche warrior and frontier settler, a bridge between two worlds destined to collide. But on this night, as she cradled her infant son within the safety of a Comanche stronghold in the Wichita Mountains, she did not yet know. The past she had left behind was coming for her once more. To be a Comanche woman was to live a life of relentless duty, bound to the rhythms of survival, the expectations of the camp, and the warriors who ruled the plains. While men hunted, fought, and secured their place in the stories told by the fire, women toiled, preparing food, tending to the horses, and ensuring that the daily needs of the camp were met. A Comanche man's wealth was measured not just by the horses he owned, but by the women who worked for him. Many took multiple wives, not out of love, but out of necessity. For in a world where war never ceased, a man needed many hands to keep his household running. Those lowest in rank, the captives, the slaves, bore the heaviest burdens, their existence reduced to labor in service of warriors who saw them as property. But for Nauta, once Cynthia Ann Parker, life had become more than just obligation. She had not merely been absorbed into the Comanche way of life, she had embraced it. She was not a slave, she was not a captive, she was the wife of Nocona, a warrior of great renown, a chief whose name carried weight across the plains. And in her heart, she loved him, not as a woman forced into marriage, but as a Comanche woman who stood proudly beside her warrior, honoring his strength, his leadership, and the legacy they were building together. Yet if she loved Nocona, it was nothing compared to the love she bore for her son. Quanah Parker, her firstborn, was the very embodiment of two worlds colliding. His blood carried the spirit of the Comanche warlord and the resilience of the frontier settler, two legacies woven into his being. To Nauta, he was not a symbol of division, but of strength, proof that he would one day rise as a leader, standing unshaken in a world where survival belonged to the strong. For years, she had known only the security of Comanche warriors, the unbreakable bond of a people who protected their own with ferocity unmatched. But on this night, as she held her child close beneath the vast, endless sky of the Wichita Mountains, a darkness loomed beyond the firelight. Her past, the world she had long forgotten, was coming for her. And this time, the warriors she had trusted would not be able to stop it. In the dense shadows of the post oak groves surrounding the village, a Navajo war party lies in wait. They have been watching, stalking for days, unseen phantoms in the hills. The day before, Comanche scouts had spotted them, but the Navajo had counted on that. They wanted Quanah and his warriors to come after them, to chase them into the wilderness, leaving the village vulnerable. The Comanche, fierce but blinded by fury, took the bait. Now the defenders left behind are the old, the wounded, and young boys yet to earn their warrior status. Under the cover of darkness, the Navajo raiders move in. Their unshod ponies make no sound on the dry earth as they creep forward, their war clubs and lances ready. They have come to spill Comanche blood, to steal Comanche horses, to strike a blow against an old and bitter enemy. The firelight flickers through the hides of the lodges, and they can see the silhouettes of those still awake inside. The village is within their grasp, but then a sound splits the night. The barking of dogs. The sentries stir. These are no seasoned warriors, just boys, but they have trained for this moment. In an instant, their howls pierce the darkness, not in fear, but in warning, their voices rising in the wolf-like cry of their people. From the lodges, men burst forth, grabbing bows, spears, and war clubs. The Navajo are no longer the hunters, they are the hunted. Arrows rain down in the moonlight, a deadly storm that forces the 16 Navajo to rethink their attack. The village is awake, and the fight will not be an easy one. They change tactics. Instead of a full-on assault, they turn their focus to the true wealth of the Comanche, the horses. The Comanche, the greatest riders the plains had ever known, are nothing without their mounts. A handful of Navajo warriors sweep along the edges of the village, distracting the defenders with quick, chaotic strikes. Meanwhile, the rest of the raiders descend upon the massive Comanche herd, cutting the rawhide tethers, driving the animals into a wild stampede. Before the Comanche can regroup, before their warriors can reclaim control, nearly 200 horses are gone, vanishing into the night, driven hard toward the southwest. By dawn, the Navajo war party is nothing more than a fading dust cloud on the horizon. For the Comanche, the loss is a wound deeper than any spear. No Comanche fell in the attack, but to be left on foot, to have their warriors grounded, was a humiliation that could not be ignored. Vengeance will come. Riders are already racing to find Quanah to tell him what has happened. And Nauta, once Cynthia Ann Parker, is left shaken, haunted by yet another raid, another night of fire, fear, and war. The air is thick with the scent of smoke and earth as Nauta clutches her newborn son, her breath shallow, her pulse racing. Fear lingers in her heart, but it is not fear alone. Rage burns just as fiercely. She had built this life from the ashes of a past that had been ripped from her. And now, in a single night, it had nearly been destroyed again, this time beneath the war clubs of Navajo raiders. But vengeance rides swiftly. As dawn stretches over the Wichita Mountains, Quanah and his warriors thunder into the village. They waste no time mourning what has been lost. There is only action, only the need for retribution. After checking on their families, Comanche war cries pierce the morning sky. The warriors ride out, their bodies low over the backs of their horses, their spirits burning with the promise of revenge. The Navajo raiders have taken more than just honor. They have stolen nearly 200 Comanche horses, the heartbeat of the people, the foundation of their power. But in their greed, they have also sealed their fate. The stolen herd slows them down. They know they cannot fight a full Comanche war party in open land, and their only hope is to outrun them, to make it back to Navajo territory before the inevitable reckoning. But the Comanche know this land as they know their own blood. Every ridge, every river, every rise of earth is familiar beneath their horses' hooves. The chase is relentless, and within hours the hunters become the hunted. The moment of reckoning comes in a storm of arrows, lances flashing in the sunlight, tomahawks slicing through the air. The Comanche descend upon their enemies, their fury swift and unforgiving. 3 Navajo warriors fall where they stand, cut down in the chaos. The rest, 13 in all, break formation, scattering in desperation toward the western horizon, leaving behind their dead and the stolen horses they had fought so hard to take. By midday, the dust settles. The Comanche have reclaimed what is theirs. There is no celebration, no boasting, only the quiet satisfaction of warriors who have upheld the honor of their people. But for Nauta, the battle is not over. As she holds her son, Quanah, in the aftermath of yet another night of violence, she cannot escape the truth. She has lived this before. The past she had buried has returned in a different form, a different enemy, but the same cruel reminder: no home, no family, no life on these plains is ever truly safe. The warriors ride into camp as the sun begins to sink below the Oklahoma horizon, their faces fierce with triumph, their lances high. Peta Nocona leads them, his presence commanding, his warriors whooping and calling out in the fading light. No Comanche blood was spilled in the fight. Their enemy has paid the price for their raid, and the warriors return not only with their stolen horses, but with vengeance satisfied. Laughter and shouts of victory fill the air, the energy in the village surging like wildfire. The bodies of the Navajo warriors who had fallen in battle now lay in pieces, a grim warning to any who dare challenge the Comanche again. For the people, this is more than just a battle won. It is a statement, a reaffirmation of their dominance over the southern plains. As darkness settles, the fires are lit. The Comanche victory dance begins. For 4 nights, the drums echo through the Wichita Mountains, their steady rhythm carrying the story of triumph. Flames leap into the sky as warriors move in unison, celebrating the power that has kept their nation strong for generations. Peta Nocona, standing at the center of it all, raises his lance high. At its tip, 3 freshly taken Navajo scalps sway in the night air. Among those watching is his newborn son, Quanah, held close in the arms of Nauta. Though barely weeks old, this is the world the child is born into, a world of warriors, of conquest, of power that seems unshakable. The fires dance in his dark eyes as he witnesses the warriors move, their voices rising in triumph. For the Comanche, it must have seemed that they were untouchable. They had turned back the Navajo, just as they had turned back the Texans, the Mexicans, the Spanish, and every other enemy who had sought to challenge them. This land belonged to them, and no one, not now, not ever, could take it from them. And yet, fate has a way of humbling even the mightiest of nations. Peta Nocona believed his son was destined for a future greater than his own. He saw a leader, a warrior, a man who would carry the name Quanah Parker into legend. And perhaps he was right. But what he could not see, what none of them could see, was that their world, the world of the Comanche, was standing at the edge of a storm. A storm that would change everything. The winds of change were already sweeping across the southern plains, though the Comanche could not yet see them. For generations they had ruled these lands, fierce and unchallenged. Their warriors feared from the Rio Grande to the Arkansas River. But now a new enemy was coming, one that could not be met with lances or arrows, one that no war party could ride against. It began in whispers, an illness creeping into the lodges of the Penateca Comanche, the largest and most southern band of the people, those who lived closest to the white settlements. At first, no one understood what was happening. Strong men were suddenly weak, their bodies racked with pain, their stomachs twisted in agony, vomiting and purging until there was nothing left. Within hours they were gone. Cholera, a sickness brought by the endless tide of settlers moving westward. It struck swiftly, ruthlessly, taking warriors, women, and children alike. By the time the Comanche realized the scale of the devastation, it was too late. The disease spread like wildfire, consuming not just the Penateca, but every band it touched. By the 1860s, it would claim nearly half of the Penateca band alone. This was not the first plague to haunt the people. Smallpox had come before, cutting down entire generations, leaving villages silent and empty. But cholera was different. It did not scar its victims, it stole them away before they had a chance to fight. And even as the Comanche reeled from the sickness, another force pressed against them. Settlers, ranchers, soldiers, the Republic of Texas was expanding, and the land that had once belonged only to the Comanche was being carved away, piece by piece. For Nauta, the storm came not as sickness, but in the form of Texas Rangers. In 1860, they rode into her world like ghosts from another life, bringing death and captivity in equal measure. Peta Nocona, the warrior she had built a life beside, was struck down. Her son Quanah fled into the wild, his younger brother Peanuts at his side. They would never see their mother again. For Quanah Parker, the road ahead would be long, leading him to the seat of power as the last great chief of the Comanche, a man caught between two worlds. But on this night, in 1848, none of that had come to pass. The Comanche still danced, their faces alight with the glow of the fire, believing themselves untouchable. They were still the lords of the southern plains, the Nirmanu, the people. Their downfall was not yet at hand. Not yet.